What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I'm going to show you how I scout out the best banks for catching big bass in the fall. I'm going to be using Google Earth to go around Lake Washita in Oklahoma and just break apart a bunch of these creeks and show you what I would be marking if I was going out here to target bass in the fall. So we're going to go to a couple different sections of this lake. The first section we're going to go to is basically on the far lower end of this lake. You have a lot of clear water. There's actually some shallow grass and things like that also in this section of the lake. So we're going to look through that. This image is taken from October of 2011 for this analysis here. And as we scroll into a lot of these banks on Lake Washita, you'll notice that there's a lot of them that are very, very flat. And these flat banks are basically going to be everywhere you look. But not every single one of these banks is created equally. And there's a few different things that you can really pay attention to if you really scrutinize these images. So as I was scrolling through, there's a couple things I just saw, and I'm just going to point out what looks good to me. But one thing I noticed right off the bat is on this flat bank, you can see some really nice rock right here. It's right off the main lake. Now, not all main lake areas are always going to be good in the fall, but if they are pulling any current or anything like that, this could actually be a fantastic fall bank, or if there's going to be a lot of wind blowing in there. It's one of the few banks down this stretch that has that super nice rock. There's actually another stretch right here of nice rock right there. And so if we kind of scroll through here, there may be a couple. There's actually a little rock off that island. There's a little rock through here. But most of these banks don't have a ton of rock on them if we just kind of scroll through relatively quick. And the few stretches that do are definitely going to be things I would call out. So if I was going to go through this area myself and I was fishing a trip out here on this end of the lake, I would actually come in here. I would take my little marker. I would mark rock on this right here. So I would hit rock. And then I'm just going to copy that real quick and mark that. So we got some nice chunk rock there. I would come over here to that little rock. It's actually a rock vein right here and here. I really like these two little rocky spots. And the reason I'm picking out these rocky banks is because this is where most of the shad are going to congregate, because the rock is going to capture more plankton, things like that, which is going to attract more shad, which will attract more bass. And if there's wind blowing, it's just a great ambush zone. So we're going to go through all of these. We're going to mark these little rocky stretches. And this is the type of stuff that I would pull up and make a handful of casts with a topwater, with a crankbait, things like that. And I would wait until I find a situation where the wind is blowing in on these spots. If the wind, for example, is blowing from the north, I probably wouldn't be running these little rocky veins, because without that wind blowing into them, they're not going to be as effective. But if you get a south wind, it is game on. So we could go through here and we can mark, a few more of these spots. Here's another little deal. And what I want to do is I want to mark a lot of these banks, and I want to mark enough of them where I can start developing a pattern of whether these fish are going to be further back in these little short pockets. They're going to be more on the main lake points. So you want to have, a few of these little rocky points. There's another one right here. You can see a few of these marked so you can run a pattern if these turn out to be really good. Not every point has rock on it, so just want to search around for those. And then you also want to make sure that you have enough of those little rocky spots further back up into some of these pockets and creeks. And again, not every single one is going to have one, as we can kind of notice here. Another thing that kind of jumps off the screen, though, in this area is we're going to have some of these transitions from more of like a sandy bank to a more mud or clay bank. And sometimes these transition zones can be really, really effective, especially if it's the only type of bottom composition change. If there's not a ton of rock or anything like that on these banks, there's a nice little rocky spot right there. It's kind of nice. But there's not a ton of rock down these banks. These little transitions from darker bottom, which is going to be your more, clay banks, harder, softer mud, to that harder bottom rock area. These are going to be really key stretches I'm going to be marking. Now I'm going to try to mark as many of those as I can again as we get through here. So here's kind of another one. I would just mark all of these. I'm not going to drop a million waypoints, but you guys get the idea. So that's the second thing I'm looking for down these banks. The third is I actually want to look for little ditches or indentations that are not obvious to the naked eye. What I mean by that is I want to go down some of these stretches and find something that looks like this right here. Basically, we have a very nice flat bank here, and then a little subtle ditch that is not visible usually when that lake is up. If we pull the lake up to a normal pool, I guess it does look a little bit more obvious now I see it, but it's kind of subtle. You can see there's like a little dip, but it's kind of hard to tell, and mainly you're going to be looking at these bigger pockets of bigger creeks. So what I want to see is basically a zone where you have a nice sharp cut or a nice pocket like that. And the reason is because a lot of these fish will actually set up in these little short little guts and cuts in shallow grass or in any sort of rock, and you can cast right down the middle of the little guts and catch a lot of fish in the fall. There's another one right over here. You can see it's kind of subtle, these subtle little ditches. It's not an entire big creek, but it's something where I could cast a whopper plopper or a lipless crankbait or a chatterbait if there's grass there over that ditch, and it's just enough of a depression or a depth change that those fish will set up in it to ambush anything that's pulling up these points. And I can also fish these little points on either side. So I would mark both of those as well. Now I would go through the rest of this area, trying to find these things on, again, that north bank, but I also want to replicate that on the south bank over here. I don't just want to find areas that are on that north bank, because if the wind's not blowing from the south, all this is going to be calm and it's going to be harder to get bit. So I might even jump up to like a creek that's up here, or jump around to like a different zone of the lake, like maybe over here, where I can have a lot of nice different things to mark that are on that south bank. These banks over here look kind of boring, so I wouldn't really want to check that out too much. Maybe I might check out this stuff right through here. This looks kind of interesting, but you've already seen what I would mark here, so I would try to replicate that on the other side of the creek. So that's kind of on that more lower end of the lake. You did notice that I marked a lot of that stuff that's more towards the main lake. When I'm fishing on the lower end of the lake, I don't like to go as much into the backs of these creeks if possible. I like to stay on the main lake or just off the main lake, and that's because I feel like the better quality fish will set up there, and though you might not get as many bites, your chance of catching a 3, 4, 5 pounder is a lot better. I also may even go out to some of these islands and stuff that are way out here off the main lake. This could be pretty effective as well. Now, as we move further up the lake and we get to the midsection of the lake, I then will actually start moving into these creeks when you get to the midsection of the lake where you get a little bit more stained water. I find that when you get to that stained water section of the lake, those fish will set up a little bit better in these creeks, but I do want to still pick a large creek. I don't want to go check out one of these really small creeks. I want a big, long creek arm that has some winding channels and winding bends to it. So this creek right here looks really good. Basically what I'm going to do is get into one of the zones, and what I'm looking for in particular are channel swing banks. So I want to find a bank that has the creek channel swinging right up against it and then swinging away. So if we scroll through here, usually you can see these channel banks pretty easily. So we got one right here where that channel swings in, but there's not a lot going on in terms of cover or anything, but this is right here what we're looking for. So we have a really nice transition bank where you have pea gravel, sand transitioning into bigger slate or chunk rock, even bluff wall. And these transitions are going to hold a lot of the biggest fish in the fall. I'll target these with top waters, spinner baits, crankbaits, glide baits, and get some really good bites a lot of times in these zones. Now I'm going to run all of these transition banks up this creek basically through this zone right here. Here's another little transition. I'm going to go to the other side of the lake. Here's another little transition right through here. We're going to keep rolling. There's another one right here where it kind of cuts into this pocket, and there's a steep bank, cuts on either side. Same thing happens over here. And we're just going to keep running all of these. Another transition right here, really nice. And I'm going to work my way all the way up basically into these river arms, and I would just usually just drop a little pin. So I would just, drop this right here, and I would say rock transition. And I would mark all of those rock transitions. And then you can transfer all these waypoints, guys, over to your fish finder. I have a video on Fish at the Moment. I'll link in the description. That'll show you how to transfer these waypoints to your fish finder. So that's what I would do, and I would stay out of all these little pockets and coves and cuts, to be honest. You can catch some small fish in there, sometimes a random big one, but most of your bigger fish are going to be on these main drags of these bigger creeks, like right on the main channel. So if we kind of draw this channel in, basically I would expect the banks that are directly touching this line I'm making to be the banks that are going to be good, rather than the creeks that are jutting out beside it. So that's kind of what I'm looking for in these sections of the lake where you have, again, more stained water, kind of that mid-lake section, I will go back into some of these major creek arms. On the lower end, I like to stay on the main lake just because I find that's where the biggest fish set up, and these are the banks they set up on. Finally, we're going to go up this river. We're going to go, this image doesn't look super great, so let's see if we can find a better image. And we're going to get up to the main river here. Let's see if we have a good drawn down image. This one looks okay. So now that we're in like the actual main river arms of this lake, this is where I will actually, again, avoid creeks and just stay on this main channel. But this main channel or this main river sets up almost the same as like the back of this creek in the midsection of the lake. So it is almost identical to what we just talked about. So again, lower end of the lake, stay to the main lake. Mid-lake, go back in the major big creeks that have a distinct channel. Upper end of the lake, stay on the main drag. And there's actually two river arms on this lake. So there's this river arm, this river arm. I'm going to basically target two different things if I want to catch a big fish in the fall. The first is, again, these same transition banks we were talking about earlier, where it transitions from this flatter bank to the steeper bank. And there's going to be a bunch of these. There's another little steep bank that then transitions some flatter stuff. There's even a little couple laydowns and stuff which look really good. And I'm going to keep running these transition banks back through here. But in addition to the transition banks, I actually do like to fish one other thing, and that's when you get way up these rivers and you get to the point where it really starts to narrow down, like up in here. I will start fishing some of the flats back up in here. So we have a big flat. I'm going to see if I can see anything. At least it looks good on my Google Earth. So here we go. So like here's a big chunky laydown. Now this one's a little bit too shallow, but we can see there's a few other ones just off the side here. And I do like sometimes to get on the opposite side of these steeper channels, way up these rivers, and flip some of these isolated laydowns and throw a spinnerbait on them. And sometimes that can produce one or two really good bites. A lot of guys will ignore these flat, kind of silty banks way up the rivers in exchange for some of the deeper, steeper banks. You're not going to get as many big bites, and if I kind of had to, I guess, estimate where you're going to get your biggest bites, I would say you're going to get your biggest bites down here on the lower end of the lake. But it's very weather sensitive, especially when you have clear water like this. You need some wind, you need some current moving. So if you have some wind or some current blowing in these areas, I would be on the lower end of that clear water every single time. If you don't have a lot of wind, but you do have a little bit of current movement, then this midsection of the lake is going to probably be the best bet, even if it's just light wind but some currents. Maybe they're pulling your lake down for fall drawdown, stuff like that, to get the lake down. A lot of times these backs, these creeks and on those river bends can be really good. And it really kind of depends on the day whether this zone, this midsection of the lake, or the upper end is going to be better. In general, I still feel like these midsections of the lake are going to produce better quality fish on average over like maybe a 10 fishing trip window. I would say you're probably going to catch a better average quality fish in that mid lake. Usually those upper ends of the lake just don't have the same quality. But what I will say is that you're going to be catching a lot more fish and a lot more consistent up these rivers in the fall. So up the river section, the upper end of the lake, you're probably going to have a lot more bites. You're probably going to have a lot more fun. You're going to get more fish in the boat. The size won't be quite as good, but there's days where you can catch them really well and catch some good ones up these rivers. So again, that's kind of my breakdown of this. Hopefully that makes sense on the types of areas, types of banks I'm going to be checking on a lake like this. It's not going to be set in stone that these are the only things I'm looking for. Again, if there's going to be a bunch of grass, for example, growing up, I might go into some of these islands and things like that. And if there's some really sharp grass edges, you can actually see like there's a really nice drop off of some of these islands and there's a little bit of grass. So maybe I pull up and fish some of these grass edges off these islands. I may go further back into some of these creeks depending on the situation. So if, for example, the lake is really abnormally high in the fall and they haven't drawn the lake down yet and the water's 3 feet high, I may run to the backs of some of these creeks and check them out because of all that runoff that maybe there's a bunch of rain for whatever reason in September. So the situation can call for something different. I'm kind of talking about like a typical fall year, like a normal fall. So there are exceptions to like everything. There's always exceptions in bass fishing. But that's what I would do on a lake like Lake Ouachita. Lake Ouachita is very similar in a lot of regards to a lot of different highland and lowland reservoirs across the country, in the fact that it has these steeper banks like you'll find in the Highland Reservoir, but it has a lot of these flatter banks and flatter areas like you'd see in the lowland reservoir with grass. So hopefully this is a good kind of general example lake, and I'll be doing other lake breakdowns here in the future on different lakes. So if you guys want to see more of those, definitely subscribe to the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel. Make sure you like the video if you enjoyed. We'll see you guys in the next video.